Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Dorsey. It's December 12th, 2018, and I am here with a great friend of mine, Dr. Theodore Modis, who is a physicist. And many of you who are listening to this will remember that he has been at our Broker Institute. He has done contract research for Dorsey, Wright. So he's a known commodity. We have done a lot of things over the years with him. One of the first things that really made me want to get to know Theodore, Dr. Modis, was the book that he wrote called Predictions. And I think it's still relevant today. Even though it was written in the 90s, it's still relevant today. When I read that book, it so motivated me and changed the way I look at the world that I took my wife, Cindy, and we flew to Zurich, Switzerland, and had dinner with him, just to meet Dr. Modis. And I remember at that meeting, or the meeting at the dinner we had, that I made it a point to keep my mouth shut as much as I could and listen to everything that he said. And it was a great evening. And Cindy and I then, after that dinner, the next day came back to Virginia. And we have him on this line now because I'm thinking about what's going on with the economy. I'm thinking about what's going on with our market indicators. And there's a bigger thing happening here than just looking at the short-term picture of the market. Theodore Modis, in his book, he created the concept or helped further develop the concept of the S-curve. And many of you will think of the book, The Fourth Turning. You may have read it. This precedes that. And these comments that Theo has, the concept on the S-curve, precedes that book. And what we did, I had Theodore do contract research with us, and create S-curves on all the countries that had exchanges. In other words, countries like India, Italy, France, Finland, so on, and create S-curves for me on GDP. And that was really interesting to determine where a country happened to lie on its own S-curve GDP. Because you begin the S-curve, it's like we, as individuals, we're on our S-curve. We're born, we accelerate, we maturate, and we die. Unless we find another way to create a shorter-term S-curve. I can think of my father's life and how he created 3 more short-term S-curves, which I think really helped lengthen his life. But when you look at the GDPs of all the countries around the world and where they happen to lie on their S-curve, and then you get into the 4 seasons of economic growth of a country, this gets very, very interesting. And I want to introduce Theodore Modis right now. I'm going to do more listening than talking. So, Theodore, thank you so much for coming on this podcast with us. We've done so much in the past.
Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to talk to you and to your audience.
Well, let's get right into the work on the S-curve. I want you to explain the S-curve to me so people that are listening to this can understand what we're talking about.
Well, the S-curve, as the word says, is a curve in the shape of the letter S, and it's a visual representation of the natural law that governs growth in competition. That's how species population grow in nature. You put a pair of rabbits on a fenced-off grass field, and the 2 will have 4, the 4 will come 8, 16, 32 exponential. They grow exponentially for a while. All S-curves in the beginning look exponentials. And then, because it's a natural growth, and natural growth is capped, it cannot go infinitely to infinity. So after a while, the rate of growth slows down to 0. When the S-curve reaches the ceiling, when the S becomes complete and you're on the top, then the rate of growth drops to 0. So we have the S-curve, which is an S-shaped pattern, and we have the rate of growth, which is a bell-shaped pattern, because when the S-curve begins, the rate of growth is very low. When the S-curve ends, the rate of growth is very low. But in between, when the S-curve is halfway complete and the really grows very steep, there the rate of growth is a maximum. So we have a bell-shaped curve matched to the S-curve. The peak of the bell shape is right at the center of the S-curve. So what I try to do is, many consultants have done similar things, is to assign segments to this life cycle, beginning, maturation, and decline, and assign 4 segments and match them to the seasons as a metaphor. Other consultants do very similar segmentation, but they don't call on the seasons. My reason to call on the seasons is that we can borrow behaviors from that are adapted to the various seasons, and understand how they can help us into the behaviors we need in the subject we are studying. If it's GDP, what should we do in this season? For example, the summer season is when right at the top of the life cycle, when the rate growth is maximum and profits are high and everybody is happy, and there you have conservatism. There people, because you have vertical integration, it's a top-down strategies, because everything works so well, you don't touch, you don't tamper with the winning team. So summers are top-down forces, and competition is rather low. Competition is always there, but competition is relatively low in late spring and summer, and it gets higher in fall, very high in late fall and winter. You have 2 winters. You have a winter in the beginning of the S-curve, rate growth very low, and you have a winter at the end of the S-curve, again, growth very low. And then obviously you have in the winters, you have the opposite of the summer behavior. That is, in the winter you don't have conservatism, you have fundamental change, you have entrepreneurship, innovation, segmentation, all these bottom-up forces. In winter, you have to listen, the leaders have to listen to the people as opposed to impose their will. And of course, you have the intermediate positions, which is continuously rising between winter and summer. You have spring season, which is continuously rising growth rate. That's a continuous improvement type of thing. It's the work ethic. Competition is low. You're interested in your work because it's going well. You keep investing. You build capacity, etc. And the other side, the fall between summer and the following winter, you have declining growth rate. So the feelings become blame, panic, tightening the belt, and so these are highlights. I mean, in my another book I wrote, Conquering Uncertainty, I have a chapter on each season, go in detail about different behaviors. These behaviors are often observed during the seasons, but also they are the behaviors that have the least resistance, that have the bigger chance of succeeding. If I can quote the infamous medieval wise man Machiavelli, who wrote in The Prince. The Prince was a guide for leaders, for kings, for leadership. So in that book he wrote, "He who will be successful who directs his actions according to the spirit of the times, and that he whose actions do not accord with the times will not be successful." So that's what I'm calling on this metaphor with the seasons. I'm drawing behaviors and actions that are compatible with the season in which you are traversing.
Well, if we looked at the United States right now, because I think many people that are listening, I want to jump there and then we'll come back to other countries. Where do we happen to be at this point in time with the United States?
If you remember the S-curve we built a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah, I remember it.
Yeah, it's 79% completed. I extrapolated 2 years because it was done a couple of years ago. So today, that curve is 79% completed. That is well beyond the midpoint. We are approaching, the season is late fall, early winter. That's why the growth rate at this time has declined to 2%. Officially, it should be 2%, but Trump managed to get a little more. On this season, what you do is back to basics. Tightening back to basics reminds me of Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again." I mean that's a behavior back to basics, and that's the correct behavior. Another one that he's doing right. Another trouble in this season is competition is high. So competition is high. You can see that reflected on the price wars. I mean, the price wars with China are caused by Trump. President Xi would never start price wars because he's in a spring season. In spring, they don't feel the pressure of competition. So, but in late fall and early winter, competition is felt the most.
So that makes sense.
That makes sense, and I'm saying, I mean, Trump is doing it right on this time.
So, in other words, Trump has created a new S curve. Now that he has taken over as president, he's created a new S curve. But it's not. It's his S curve, and it's a shorter term S curve. It's not that the United States has played out its S curve that has been in existence for 78 years. This is a shorter term type.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's going to be Trump's curve. It's not going to be America's curve. The America's curve is still at 79%, and on top of it, there is a perturbation, a small curve that caused by Trump.
Okay, so when you think about the big curve for 78 years, you can add in a lot of people from Obama to Clinton to
it's the whole pot. I mean, everything. This curve has been determined by studying the previous 80, 90 years. So I had data for 90 years worth, and that data I fitted an S curve on the points of that data. So whatever happened during those years influenced the determination of the S curve I finally arrived at. So everybody put he chipped in. Everybody who passed in those 90 years contributed to shaping up the form of this S curve, which is now reaching completion.
Well, we're reaching completion, but if you look at our competition, look at China. China, I see here, is at the 40% level.
Oh, yeah.
And its growth rate is 6.9%.
Exactly, because China is in early summer. It hasn't even gotten into summer yet. In fact, India is even more. India is at 12%.
Yeah,
she's growing faster than China. Theoretically, okay, because these things fluctuate now from year to year. But the theoretical curve that I determined, I mean the fit curve, has India on spring and China on early summer. They're close to each other. China is ahead of India.
Now, if you look very closely to these countries, you look at Indonesia. Indonesia, I think the average age in Indonesia is probably the mid-20s, and it may be, I'm not sure, it may be the fifth largest economy in the world. It's at the 20% level. Now, think about the competition in emerging markets. Indonesia's at 20% and growing at a growth rate of 12%.
Right, that's again a spring season.
Right.
This is the time where all they're concerned about is to grow and do more of the same and keep building capacity, and everything is all systems go.
And if you go up the coast, you find Japan.
Japan, now that is an interesting story because the curve of Japan reached its ceiling 30 years ago. That is, Japan grew very fast after the war, had a nice S-curve, textbook-like, and then it started reaching a ceiling 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, and since then has been hovering on the top, neither starting a new S-curve nor starting a decline. Well, they have their changes from year to year. One year is better than the other. They claim we grew so much this year. The next year they decline. On the average, they stay flat. There's zero growth for 30 years. And the fluctuations, usually when you have zero growth, you have big fluctuations. And in Japan, they're not so big. There are fluctuations. As I say, 1 year up, 1 year down, but they're not chaos. The country has not run into chaos like Italy. Italy has run into chaos because Italy is not as far. It's only 97%. It's not 100% yet.
Well, that's
but
close.
It's very close.
And looking at less than 1% growth in Italy.
That's right.
So that's probably not a place I'd want to invest.
It's practically at the ceiling. Now you run into chaotic fluctuations, and that's what the populism is in Italy. All this big upheaval. They're trying to turn over. This is the characteristic of winter. You want to turn over everything to see, to search for new directions, to see if some way we can start growth again. So it's a bottom-up forces, and that's what I noticed in many, this rising populist movement everywhere in Europe. It's all associated with countries who are into the winter state.
Right.
Many extreme right or extreme left. I mean, sometimes the populists in France, this yellow jacket movement recently, they're all together, extreme right and extreme left. It was triggered by Macron's clumsy strategic approach, which tried to impose a top-down strategy, a vision like he was in a summer season. But he's not in a summer season, so that doesn't fit. And as Machiavelli said, he will not succeed now. And that's what's happening to him.
Yeah, France is in the early fall season. If we go back, then, well, let's go right next to. Now this is interesting here. In Germany, Germany's at the 55% level, but only growing at 2%. The 55% level, I surmise, is because Germany was totally destructed after World War II and had to rebuild.
That's right. I mean, if you look historically, Germany had a very nice curve, long-term, a big curve, that was completely interrupted with the war. It was broken down completely, and then they started with a new S-curve, which is after the war. And that grew fast and went over a summer. Now they're coming to the end of the summer. That's a turning point. It's called when you late summer before you enter fall. That's the turning point where you start blaming things, because start becoming aware that something is not quite right.
Yeah, and they're on schedule for 2%.
That's right. They cannot more. That's what it comes out, 2% for Germany too.
If you go back to the Far East, it's interesting to note that Singapore is only at 21% with a 6% potential growth. Malaysia is at 30% with a 7% potential growth.
That's right.
And
all these are spring seasons, you know.
Yeah, they're in the spring seasons, and that would suggest to me that's a place that I want to invest.
Oh yes, I mean those guys can only go up. I mean they will even more than China. I would say they may be the same percentage growth rate, but China has already 40% saturation, while these guys are at 30%. So they have more growth. Of course, China is much bigger, so you have to counteract the size of the market.
Yeah, usually a large country would have a slower growth, would have a lower growth, but China has a 6.9% growth.
Well, right? The growth rate is where you are on the curve, not so much how big you are.
Okay.
Because India is much less, and it has a higher growth rate because it's even smaller than, China at 40% is growing at 6.9. India at 12% is growing at 7.5%. So they're even earlier in the curve, so they grow faster. They're comparable in size.
Well, where you live is Switzerland.
Yeah.
Is at 56%, but a 1.9% growth.
It's a late summer. It's like Germany. Switzerland is close to Germany and emulates quite a bit what's happening in the neighborhood. So...
Let's talk about Brexit for a second. United Kingdom at 78%.
Well, United Kingdom is very close to America, 78% penetration. The curve is high up there in the late fall, early winter season. So it's driven by bottom-up forces. The Brexit is a complaint of the people. They weren't happy. They were they wanted a change. I guess that's what they're trying to do now, but it's messy because they got tangled up with the EU.
Right. Looking at a couple of other countries here, interesting that if we go back to the A's, Australia is at 9% penetration of its GDP S-curve with a 5.6% growth rate, and Austria, next to Germany,
it's the opposite.
Is at 61% and 2.3.
Yeah, one is in early spring, the other one is in early fall.
Yeah.
I mean, these are complementary countries. Well, Austria is small and old country, very conservative, and has grown. Australia is a big country, still a lot of empty space there, and it has a lot of growth potential. I mean, I'm surprised it's only 5.6%. I would expect it to be even higher, but it's too early yet. I mean, when it goes to 15 penetration, the growth rate will go higher. The growth rate in Australia will keep growing until it reaches the midpoint, remember? The growth rate keeps growing all the way until the S-curve reaches the midpoint, and only after that starts declining.
Right.
So Australia has a long growth rate, rosy future.
And one of the countries we have not talked about yet is Russia. And I think that's on everyone's mind.
Yeah, well, Russia had trouble with Russia because the inflation plays big games there. There's nothing reasonable to do with inflation. You see, all these numbers that we did were on nominal GDP.
Right.
That's the current dollars. Now, if that depends on the inflation to reflect what the really is happening in the economy, and the Russian inflation fluctuated so much that the curve was not resembling an S-curve. So I corrected for inflation, and I treated the real GDP for Russia, and it ended up in 20% penetration level with a 5% growth rate. Now, that you don't see that, of course, because what you see on everyday life is the nominal GDP. That's why I insisted to study the nominal GDP, so people know if we say 2% growth, what we mean. Because the 5% growth for Russia has to be interpreted. What will people see depending on the inflation? And I looked at the inflation of Russia, and it was up to 70% a year ago, and then it got negative, and then it got up again to a few percent now. So it's clear that it has a lot of future. I mean, it's in a spring season one way or another because it hasn't reached the full development. It's an enormous country and lots of resources. I believe the number that we see here, 20% penetration with 5% growth rate. But this 5%, as I say, has to be interpreted depending what the inflation will be in that country.
Well, let's go back to the U.S. for a second, Theo, and I'm gonna give you a question that's kind of like way out in left field. Has Donald Trump done the right thing? Has he done what he should be doing to keep us on our S-curve and growing?
Well, I pointed out a couple of places where he is right. Now, yes, I mean he was right with the price war because he has to fight competition, and the competition is very intense. The back to basics approach is correct, and his sensitivity to the people's wishes also is very correct because he doesn't show it, but he does it. He's sensitive to what people want, and that's the bottom up where what he'd be doing in this season. Now, what else could he do? You have a system in America that president cannot do whatever he wants. I mean, his hands are tied in some way. So I don't see what could he do to go faster, or to cultivate the curve more. Barring, of course, questions like declare war and go to conquer other. I mean, we don't consider this possibility these days. It used to happen 100 years ago very easily, but not anymore. So, barring these alternatives, I don't see what else Trump could have done to do better performance. As I say, according to my forecast, he did better. He did better than I thought he would.
Yeah, I think better than most people thought he would. Yeah, things are humming along here. Well, it's interesting. You know, we've had such a hard time with the stock market. Of course, the stock market will do what it wants to do. Is there anything else you want to add to these S-curves, Theo? Because I'm going to ask you a question about a new book. I know I'm going to surprise you, ask you a question about a new book you've written.
Well, the S-curves it's a topic that I sort of pioneered together with a few others many years ago, but it's always topical because nowadays they talk about disruptive innovation and disruption. Disruption is a jargon that recently you hear it all the time. What they mean is changing from one S-curve to another. So what I'm saying is that the approach we're using is powerful and has a potential for explaining, for clarifying, and throwing light into what is happening, and it's still in the news.
Right. Well, Theo, I want to thank you for your input here, but I'm not going to let you go just yet. You have written a new book that has been touted as potentially becoming a movie. And I want you to tell me about this new book, because when I read your books, I find them so fascinating, and your book predictions change the way I look at the world. I'm interested to read this book too. So tell us about that.
Well, it's not on the same subject. I mean, it's not a business book, not at all. And I wrote it only because it's a fascinating story. It is a biographical, historical novel of my mother's amazing life and the Modis family in general, the history, because I was born into a historic and tragic family in Greek Macedonia on my father's side. And my mother came from Constantinople. That's what they called Istanbul when she was there. At the turn of the 20th century, Greek Macedonia and other Balkan states were all under Turkish occupation. And during the World War I, Greece and Turkey fought on opposite camps, of course. But even though the war finished in 1918, Greeks and Turks continued fighting each other for another 5 years, following which the world's greatest ethnic cleansing took place. 2 million people were displaced on ethnic grounds. 1.5 million Greeks moved from Anatolia to Greece, and 500,000 Turks moved from Greece to Turkey. My mother was caught up in this massive population exchange. She was a young teenager who lost both her parents, and with a younger sister, she ended up in a refugee camp in northern Greece. But with determination, she created a life of her own in the new country, became a teacher in a small mountain town, married a young lawyer from a historic and tragic family, Macedonian family, and her story involves through a whole century of war and peace. The story is peppered with likable characters, with horrific events, and an intricate love story. Among the protagonists are 2 strong women, a charming and indomitable man, and a sickly kid. That was me. People who read the advanced copies of the book gave it high praise. A Greek movie director told me that the book could very well become an amazing television series as well as a movie, but he added that it wouldn't be cheap to make because it spans the better part of a century, and it's chock full of turbulence, exotic geographic locations, and spectacular events. So he suggested that I begin searching for a producer in America. He told me, try to get the rich Greek immigrants in America to help you.
Well, it's a good idea.
I think the book can make a very nice Christmas present. In fact, Columbia University Press, who is distributing in America, is selling it with a 30% discount.
Oh, wow.
But you must use the coupon number CUP30. CUP for Columbia University Press, and the number 30. What was fascinating about the book has no pictures in it, but I found some amazing pictures in the internet. And in fact, at the end of the book, I give the password to go to a URL, my website. You get with this password, you get 200 pictures, historical interest, relating to the book story. I just describe to you one or two pictures. One of them is a video of my grandfather's funeral. He was assassinated by the Bulgarians who were trying to take over northern Greece at the time. In 1904, there were no movies, but this little video that I found on the internet, I don't know who put it up there, is composed of shots, of stills, of pictures. I found another picture of a Nazi officer in the little town I was born. Of course, the town was occupied by the Nazis, and this guy went to the nearby mountain, and he wanted to pose for his family or for his girlfriend or whatever. You can see he is one of those Aryans, blonde with SS on his lapels, and he's posing. On behind him, there's the town I was born. You see, and there you can clearly distinguish our house because it was a big house with a semicircular balcony, and on the balcony is my grandmother. She's one of the protagonists of the book.
Oh wow!
I came across this picture of this Nazi guy posing for his family, and I see my grandmother on top of him. Another picture is my uncle. As I say, my father's family has a big story. My uncle was the first governor in the Thessaloniki, the big town in northern Greece, the capital of Macedonia, when it was liberated from the Germans. So the Germans are leaving, and the town is given to is transferred to the Greek powers, taken over by my uncle, who is being seen on a car, on an open convertible car, with an Indian driving, because it was the Anglo-Indian division that took over from the Germans. The English and the Indians with them while they were fighting the Germans, and they drove in this big car with my uncle waving to the crowds. There are lots of crowds around because they're so happy to have the Germans gone. And he wrote himself that it was like a Maharaja arriving in town, prepared by the English in the tradition they learned of viceroys and Maharajas in India. So lots of pictures like this. It's amazing what you can find in the internet these days, which I didn't expect to find, but these are not on the book. These are all tangential, as I say. The people who read the book will get a password at the end to go and look at these pictures if they're interested in.
And you can get that on Kindle also, right?
Oh, yeah, it's coming out on Kindle with a different cover, by the way, because they want to make a snazzier cover to make a greater appeal. It will be soon on Kindle. It's not up there yet, but it will be.
Okay. Theo, that's fantastic.
Well,
that is fantastic.
It's my pleasure to talk to you, Tom.
I enjoyed this. I always enjoyed this, especially when you come to the Broker Institute and we talk about the S-curves and what's happening in the world. Looking at these numbers right now, I know where my mind goes, and that's the Far East for investment. Yeah, that seems reasonable. I wouldn't exclude Australia. That's Far East. I'm sorry. I almost consider that. I almost consider that Far East too. Yeah, that's Far East, all right. Yeah. Well, Theo, thank you very much, and we'll go ahead and wrap this up today. I really enjoyed it. Love to hear any comments from anyone who's listening to it. We're trying to do different podcasts and unique things, and Theodore Modis has always been unique, to say the least. Thank you, Tom. You're very kind. Thank you for calling in and from Switzerland, and time to go to bed. Okay. All right, big guy. Good night. Yeah, bye-bye. Bye.